Picture this, a young
One,
girl, just
two,
12, bought like
three.
property
That's
for
all there is.
$1,000. She wasn't kidnapped by strangers. She was handed over by the very people sworn to protect her. Betrayed, abandoned, and thrust into a world she never asked for. It sounds unbelievable, but it happened. In a moment driven by desperation and greed, a price was placed on her childhood, and her life was changed forever. What no one expected was how that decision would ripple outward, how that $1,000 couldn't silence truth and eventually shattered a household's lies. The ending? It left everyone speechless, rewriting what they thought they knew about justice, family, and worth. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming stories. This is the story of how one decision, driven by greed, set off a chain of events no one could control. They called her Anna, a child who should have been playing in the fields or sitting in a classroom, but instead found herself at the center of a decision that would haunt everyone involved. She didn't run away. She wasn't stolen in the night by masked strangers. No, Anna was betrayed by those who shared her own blood. It wasn't just a mistake. It was a choice. And the question still hangs heavy. What drives a family to trade their own for a stack of bills? Was it poverty or was it greed? That single exchange for $1,000 would set her on a path filled with shadows. She believed she was leaving for opportunity, but what awaited her behind the gates of that mansion was far from the future she imagined. Who betrayed her? Why was she sold? And what happened in that mansion that would leave everyone silent in the end? $1,000 was the price of her freedom. But what would that money really buy? Anna was 12 years old, and in her heart lived a dream so simple yet so powerful. The chance to sit in a classroom, to hold a pencil, to see her name written neatly across the top of a page. She had lost her parents years earlier to an illness that swept through her small town, leaving her in the care of an aunt who wore bitterness like a second skin. Each morning, Anna rose before the sun, fetching water with a cracked pot, gathering firewood, and cooking thin porridge that barely filled the bowls on the table. Her hands were small, but already hardened by labor, her back bent under tasks no child should carry. Yet even in the weight of hardship, Anna carried hope that one day, education would free her from the dust and hunger of her days. But her aunt, stern and sharp-tongued, saw Anna not as a child with dreams, but as another mouth to feed, another burden dragging her family deeper into struggle. And it was in those long afternoons, while Anna's hands scrubbed clothes by the stream, that her aunt would sit with Mama Ruth, a woman whose eyes flickered whenever money was mentioned. Together, they whispered in low tones, casting glances at Anna as though she were less a child and more an opportunity waiting to be cashed. Anna believed that the scolding, the endless chores, the harsh words were simply discipline, but what she didn't know was that the whispers behind her back were shaping her future. Neighbors often said Anna was quiet, obedient, respectful, the kind of child who never raised her voice and who accepted her fate with bowed head and blistered palms. Yet inside, Anna dreamed of something larger, imagined herself walking through city streets in a clean uniform, books pressed to her chest. She didn't see herself as a burden. She believed she could be a blessing. What she didn't know was that her aunt and Mama Ruth had already begun plotting, measuring her worth not in dreams or love, but in the currency of survival and greed. They told themselves it was for the family, but the truth was colder. Anna thought the world was finally about to change in her favor. She believed she was going to school, but her aunt had already made a deal. The day began like any other, but beneath the routine a decision had already been sealed. Anna woke before dawn, her bare feet padding across the packed earth as she fetched water for the household. She hummed softly to herself, unaware that while she bent over the stream, her aunt was seated in a shaded corner of the marketplace with Mama Ruth, waiting for a man whose arrival promised to change everything. He came dressed in clean clothes, carrying a leather bag that seemed too heavy for comfort. He spoke little, his eyes glancing only briefly at Anna's aunt before resting on the table between them. And then came the sound that would define the betrayal, the crisp thud of bills being stacked, one after another, until the amount reached $1,000. No words of care, no hesitation, just a transaction that reduced Anna's worth to paper. Her aunt's hands trembled as she touched the money, not out of guilt, but from the weight of a choice she could never take back. Mama Ruth leaned in, whispering reassurances, telling her it was for the best, that Anna's life would improve, that this was the only way. Meanwhile, Anna returned home carrying the jug of water on her head, unaware that the household she entered no longer saw her as family, but as a debt repaid. That night, her aunt sat her down, her voice suddenly softer than usual, speaking of opportunity, of education in the city, of new doors opening. Anna's heart swelled at the thought, never doubting for a moment that her aunt's words were anything but true. The following morning, Anna was dressed in her best clothes. Though they were worn and faded, they were neatly pressed as though she were truly headed for school. She hugged her small bundle of belongings, tied in a cloth she had sewn herself, and looked back at the only home she had ever known. The dust rose around the cart that waited to take her away, and she waved, tears in her eyes, promising to return one day to show her aunt all that she would accomplish. But her aunt stood there stiffly, her eyes fixed not on Anna, but on the bills she had tucked away in her pocket. Anna believed she was stepping into the promise of a better future. She didn't know she had been sold. And when she stepped into that mansion, she realized the truth was far darker than she ever imagined. Anna's journey ended not at a school gate, but at the towering walls of a mansion whose size left her speechless. To the world outside, it was a palace of wealth, grand staircases, polished floors, the echo of power in every corner. But to Anna, it was a prison. The guards were firm, their eyes cold, their instructions clear. She was to obey, to remain silent, to forget the promises of books and classrooms. Days blurred into weeks as she was trained not for learning but for servitude. Every trace of her childhood stripped away by commands that echoed louder than her dreams. She would stand at windows gazing at the city below, longing for freedom, but always with someone watching, always with the reminder that her life had been bought and paid for. Back in her village, silence could not hide everything. Neighbors noticed her absence, noticed how quickly her aunt avoided questions. When asked where Anna had gone, the aunt repeated the story of education in the city, her voice rehearsed, her eyes drifting nervously toward Mama Ruth, who often stood nearby. But children have a way of asking what adults fear to answer, and Anna's young cousin grew suspicious. Why had Anna left so suddenly? Why had there been no letters, no word, no proof of this promised school? The whispers began to spread, first among friends, then across families, until even the marketplace buzzed with doubts that the aunt could not silence. Rumors grew into gossip, and gossip reached ears that mattered. Local authorities heard fragments of a story that didn't align, fragments of a girl who had vanished into the city with no trace. A police officer visited once, casually asking about Anna's whereabouts, but left unsatisfied with the answers given. The aunt's heart began to pound each time someone knocked at her door, while Mama Ruth urged her to remain calm, to remember the story they had agreed upon. Yet cracks were forming, and the community's eyes grew sharper. The press began to sniff around, intrigued by the tale of a girl promised education yet swallowed by silence. The pressure mounted, the lie stretched thin, and it seemed that at any moment, the truth would come crashing down. But just when it seemed the truth might come out, someone unexpected stepped in, and everything changed. In the city, Anna's silence hid a truth that no walls could contain. The man who had paid $1,000 for her life was not simply a wealthy benefactor. His fortune was riddled with shadows, his dealings whispered about in boardrooms and alleys alike. To the outside world, he was a billionaire whose name carried respect, but behind the marble gates lay secrets that reporters had been chasing for years. It was one such journalist, determined and unafraid, who stumbled upon Anna's existence. Receipts were uncovered, evidence of money transferred, testimony from staff who had seen her arrive with nothing but a small cloth bundle, her eyes wide with confusion. Each discovery peeled back another layer, exposing a network of lies tied not only to Anna's fate, but to the very image of power her captor had built. As the story spread, the walls of the mansion could no longer contain it. The authorities, once hesitant, now had reason to act. Courtrooms buzzed with whispered speculation as documents were presented, as names were read aloud, as the image of generosity painted by the aunt began to unravel under questioning. Interrogations revealed contradictions, and soon her aunt could no longer maintain the practiced tale of education and opportunity. In a trembling voice, she confessed that she had done it for survival, claiming that by handing Anna over, she had spared her from hunger and despair. She framed betrayal as sacrifice, insisting that $1,000 had not been blood money but a lifeline. Yet in the silence that followed her words, the weight of the truth was unmistakable. A child's future had been traded for cash. For Anna, sitting quietly in the courtroom, the pain was sharper than any verdict. To hear her aunt speak of betrayal as though it were kindness was to feel her heart break anew. Every glance toward Mama Ruth only deepened the wound, for it was clear the whispers had not been born of desperation alone, but of choice. The betrayal was undeniable, and the claim of salvation was a mask too thin to cover it. The room fell heavy with emotion as spectators realized this was more than a legal battle. It was the tearing apart of family, of trust, of innocence lost forever. And yet, even as the revelations brought gasps and outrage, what no one knew was that the final twist would leave everyone speechless. Years passed, and Anna, no longer the frightened 12-year-old, returned to the courtroom as a woman shaped by pain but not broken by it. The hall was filled with murmurs as she walked in, her steps steady, her gaze unwavering. Her aunt sat at the front, aged by the years and consumed by the weight of her choices. Mama Ruth avoided Anna's eyes, her head lowered in shame. All around them, the air was thick with expectation. Would Anna unleash anger? Would she demand punishment? Would she call for retribution? Instead, she chose a silence that commanded attention. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, carrying not rage but truth, and every ear leaned forward to hear the words that cut deeper than any accusation could. "You sold me for $1,000, Anna said, her voice even, her eyes locked on her aunt's. But what you really lost was me." The room fell into a stillness so heavy it seemed time itself paused. Her aunt, once proud and defiant, crumbled at those words. Tears carved lines into her face as she covered her mouth with trembling hands, realizing that no verdict, no sentence, no apology could ever return what had been taken. Mama Ruth wept quietly, her shoulders shaking as she whispered prayers no one could hear. The spectators were torn. Justice had been spoken, but the scar of betrayal would remain long after the court adjourned. Anna turned, her figure illuminated by the light spilling in from the tall windows. She walked with dignity, each step a reminder that while her childhood had been stolen, her strength had not. The court clerk read the judgment, but few listened, for the true verdict had already been delivered in Anna's words. She left behind not vengeance but reflection, and in her silence was a lesson that echoed beyond the walls of that courtroom. Greed may destroy families, but dignity endures. Betrayal may cut deep, but it is integrity that survives the longest. And as the doors closed behind her, the truth of her worth could no longer be measured in numbers. $1,000 was the price they had put on her life, but her worth, beyond measure. Anna's story is one that lingers long after the final words are spoken. She was sold for $1,000 by the very people meant to protect her, yet she chose dignity over vengeance when it mattered most. Her calm truth in that courtroom shook more than walls. It shook hearts. But now I want to turn to you. What would you have done if you were in Anna's place? Would you have confronted your aunt with anger, or chosen words that carried the weight of grace instead? Do you believe justice was truly served, or do scars like hers prove that some wounds never fully heal? Share your thoughts in the comments. We read everyone. And if you thought this was shocking, wait until you hear about the woman who returned from the dead at her husband's wedding. Subscribe for more real-life twists that will leave you speechless.